Hi there, I'm Scott, and this is GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn, episode 17. Today I'm going to be dyeing a skein of 100% Super-wash BFL, and I'm also going to be dyeing a skein of 75-25 Merino Nylon. These are both fingering weight yarns, and with this dyeing experiment, I'm going to be able to see some of the differences between these two bases. One thing that I notice immediately is, although these pictures don't show it as much, the BFL has a creamier base than the Merino. I have these skeins soaking in about 8 cups of water with 2 tablespoons of vinegar. I'll let these soak for probably 30 to 40 minutes so that they are well saturated and ready to take up some dye. The dyeing experiments that I'm using today are based on a inspiration photo that actually comes from Lauren at A Girl and Her Wool on YouTube. She is a indie dyer who makes lovely skeins of yarn, and she also has a YouTube channel where she shares some of her dyeing techniques and her dyeing journey. One of her challenges was to have us also dye skeins of yarn, those of us who wanted to, based on this photo. And so this is basically where my inspiration comes from, even though, well, we'll see what we think at the end when it comes to the final look and feel of these skeins of yarn. I will be dyeing these skeins of yarn using Wilton's Icing food coloring in violet, pink, and I'm also going to create some sugar sprinkles using burgundy, Kelly green, and lemon yellow. So to start off our process, I'm going to show you that I'm mixing up one of the dyes, and I'm also going to mix up some of the sugar sprinkles using those dyes. Now, after I use these medicine bottles to do the mixing, I also spread them out on some wax paper so that the sugar sprinkles will dry. So now I have my lightly twisted skein of yarn in a warm dye pot with a little bit of water in there. And onto this, I'm going to put my first color, which is going to be the pink color. It's not going to be an all-over color. I'm using some of this twist as a resist to maintain some white space on the yarn. And here I am coming in with that pink. And I believe this is the Merino 75-25 Super-wash Merino Nylon blend. I'm going to let that go ahead and heat. And while that's heating, I'm going to also do the BFL. And I'll let that that color completely absorb into these skeins. Once those skeins have absorbed, I'm actually going to put them together to add the violet to these skeins of yarn. Now with the skeins of yarn both in the same pot, they're going to act as sort of a resist to each other. There's no real twist to these skeins of yarn. They're just laying in the pot right now. So to this, I'm going to pour the violet just randomly over the top. And then just let that go ahead and absorb into this skein of yarn. So I'll go ahead and pull these out now that that violet has completely absorbed. And these look really, really interesting. Some of that violet has broken a little bit, so there's some blues as well as the pinks and the purples. Now I'm going to put these two skeins into my steamer basket, and I'm going to add my sugar sprinkles. I'm going to start with the yellow, and I'm going relatively heavy, knowing especially that the yellow isn't always very pigmented, so I just kind of want to make sure that it shows up a little bit. I will go ahead and add also some of those other colors as well after this yellow has set a bit. So here I am adding some of those additional colors, moving the skeins around, adding the yellow, the green, and the magenta. Or not magenta, burgundy. With some of those speckles on there, I am wanting to add a little bit more violet. So I'm going to go an overwash of the violet color and let that absorb. And I'm going to add a little bit of vinegar as well. Once that color is absorbed and the yarn has cooled off, I'm ready now to rinse my skeins of yarn.
Of course. Update.
They still, well, especially the BFL looks a little pink, even though it really, I mean, it went through the exact same process as the Merino, but because of the difference in the fiber, the dye does take up some slightly differently. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse these. The rinsing process is, of course, to rinse out any of the acid, and which I use vinegar, so it does kind of smell. And also dislodge any additional dyes that may not have fully absorbed into the fiber. What I'm seeing is I'm not actually seeing any bleeding initially, so it looks pretty good. If there was substantial bleeding, I could put it back into a vinegar water bath and reheat the yarn for another 20 minutes. And that usually will set that color into the fiber. But I'm not seeing any significant bleeding from just water. So now I'm going to add a little bit of mild clear dish soap just about a dime size in my hand.
Is that your dough blade?
And see what if there's any additional bleeding from the addition of soap. Sometimes that will occur.
For pureeing and whatever else.
And in my experience, the colors that for me tend to bleed are pinks and yellows. I know pink sometimes takes some additional heat and some additional time in order to absorb. My guess is that yellow is probably the same. But that water looks clear. So I'm going to just finish rinsing out the soap from these skeins of yarn. Then I'll hang them to dry. When it was finished drying, I took a look at the dry skeins of yarn, and I was not particularly pleased with them. So I put them back into a shallow dye pan off camera and added another wash of some a light violet food coloring dye to tone down the pinks and bring out more of the blues and violet on these skeins. So that's what you're seeing here is that final absorption of that violet wash that I put over both skeins to kind of tone down how pink they seemed to me, because I wanted more of a violet color. So once both skeins had dried, here's their finished product. The BFL there is on the top, and the Merino nylon blend is on the bottom. They both exhibit, the pinks and the purples with some of those speckles of yellows and greens and oranges and that came out. The BFL still kind of leans more towards the pink and not the more bluish violet. But I still like it. I still like how it turned out. Here's that BFL skein on its own. And then here's the detail of it. And you can see some of those speckles and areas where those the different speckles came in on this skein. Here's how the Merino turned out, which is a little bit more to my liking. And then here's the detail of that Merino skein. And I just wanted to bring back up that inspiration photo so we can get kind of a sense of what was there. What I was really going for were those light purples, but things got a bit heavy, which I don't know if that's an aspect of me not being particularly familiar yet with how much dye to use, or if it's just the finicky nature of food coloring. I'm not sure. But these are pretty skeins, and I do like how they turned out. So here's where they are all twisted into hanks. You can see that there on the right, you have the BFL, which took the dye really significantly differently than the Merino. The Merino did absorb the blues a bit better, whereas the BFL 10 looks to have taken up those reds a bit more extensively. So that's kind of an interesting thing for me to know as I continue dyeing additional skeins of yarn in these two different bases. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of me dyeing up a couple of skeins of yarn. I really do like how they turned out, and I can't wait to make use of them in some projects. If you have enjoyed this episode, please be sure to click like. And if you like what you see on this channel, subscribe and click on that bell icon so that you will be informed of future episodes that get uploaded. You can find me on social media. I have a Facebook page of GreatScott Knitting. I am on Instagram as GreatScott Knitting, and I'm on Ravelry as GreatScott KCMO. So be sure and check me out on any of those venues as well. In the meantime, may you have peace in the home and the fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Bye.